It was the only one I had left. Are you happy now? You ripped it. The dress, thin, faded cotton the color of a bruised twilight, hung in tatters. Not dramatically ripped in a single tear, but deliberately, brutally snagged on a stray hook, as the security guard, a man named Bartholomew whose face was a roadmap of petty authority, shoved her away from the velvet rope. Before we continue, please subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Ilara didn't scream or claw at him, she just sagged against the cool marble wall of the Hotel Volkov lobby, clutching the shredded hem. The tear didn't stop at the calf, it went up past her knee, exposing the thin, scraped skin beneath. She was already so tired. She'd been up since 4 a.m., working 2 shifts, one at the laundromat, one cleaning offices, just to save enough for the bus ticket, just to get here. This wasn't a social visit. I said move, girl, Bartholomew growled, his breath smelling of stale coffee and something sour. The petition is closed, and this is a private event. You think you can just wander in here looking like that? His gaze raked over her, lingering on the threadbare fabric, the cheap scuffed flats she wore, and the single faded spot of dampness on her shoulder where she'd wiped away a stress tear on the walk over. She looked at the small, tightly folded piece of paper in her hand, the petition, signed by 24 elderly tenants, begging the notorious Volkov group not to demolish their historic, rent-controlled apartment building. This was her last hope. The demolition was scheduled for dawn. Her grandmother, who'd raised her, was upstairs in their tiny apartment, too frail to leave, too proud to cry. Please, Ilara whispered, the plea catching in her throat like a splinter of bone. It's not for me, it's for the families. They can't just be put out on the street. I just need to speak to whoever is in charge. Just for 5 minutes. She saw them then, the audience. A cluster of impeccably dressed guests stood near the enormous, glittering chandelier, champagne flutes in hand. They weren't whispering, they were watching openly, their expressions ranging from cold amusement to outright disgust. A woman in a dress the color of ice, cinched tight at a waist that had never known a hard day's work, tilted her head and let out a small, sharp laugh. "Oh look, Cynthia," a man drawled, adjusting the cuff of his blindingly expensive suit. "A charity case. Did she escape from the sewer grate? Or perhaps she thinks this is a Halloween costume party." Cynthia, whose diamond necklace probably cost more than Ilara would earn in a lifetime, sipped her drink and smiled thinly. The nerve, coming to a Volkov gala dressed like a beggar. Doesn't she know the impression she's making? Honestly, Bartholomew, just call the police and have her removed. She's dragging down the ambiance. The security guard swelled with importance. He glanced at the spectators, his chest puffed out, validating his cruelty. This was the moment she always dreaded, when her struggle became entertainment for others, when her poverty was not just a burden but a stain. The image flashed in her mind, her mother's hands, empty, waving goodbye from a battered pickup truck years ago. "Go live with Grandma, sweetie. Mama needs a new start." The new start never included coming back. Ilara was 9. The betrayal had taught her a lesson sharper than any knife. You are on your own. Her grandmother, a former seamstress, had tried, but her frail health and the rising cost of living had steadily chipped away at their stability. The little cotton dress, now ruined, was the last thing her grandmother had made her, years ago, on a sputtering old machine. It was patched, yes, but it was made with love. The humiliation settled on her shoulders, like a lead blanket. She wasn't just begging for the tenants, she was begging for her grandmother, for the only home she'd ever known, for the last remnants of her dignity. And these people, with their easy lives and their smooth, contemptuous voices, were enjoying the spectacle of her downfall. "I won't call the police, ma'am," Bartholomew said, savoring the false politeness, his voice now loud enough for the gallery. "I'll just let her realize how cheap she looks against this backdrop. Maybe then she'll learn her place." He gestured pointedly to the tear in the dress. "Look at that fabric. You could probably get that whole disaster for $5 at a flea market. It's a disgrace to the establishment. Now, get out, before I make it worse." His words hit her like a physical blow. Cheap. Not just the dress, but her life, her hope, her entire existence. She felt the hot sting behind her eyes, the familiar burn of tears that she refused to let fall. Crying would give them what they wanted, total victory. She dug her fingernails into the petition, crumbling the paper, but she couldn't move. Her legs felt like hollow reeds. The fear was a cold, constricting snake around her throat. She had stood up to them, and now she was ruined. They would call the police, they would make a scene, and her grandmother would find out and worry herself sick. This was the breaking point. She felt the crushing weight of a world that cared nothing for the kind and struggling only for the powerful and cold. Bartholomew took a heavy step toward her, his hand reaching out, not to escort her, but to physically shove her toward the revolving doors. "Last chance, slumdog, before I drag you." She flinched, closing her eyes, bracing for the impact, the final messy end to her futile stand, and that's when the air in the massive lobby changed. It wasn't a sound or a light, it was a pressure drop, a palpable shift in the atmosphere, as if a silent, heavy door had just slammed shut on the outside world. The gallery of onlookers, previously so animated, suddenly froze. The woman named Cynthia stopped mid-sip, her champagne flute hovering near her lips. The man adjusting his cuff let his hand drop. Bartholomew's reaching hand paused in mid-air, rigid. Ilara opened her eyes, startled not by force but by the absolute sudden silence. The silence had a name. Nikolai Volkov. He didn't make a grand entrance. He merely stepped out from behind a large, decorative obsidian column near the elevator bank, where he must have been standing and observing for some time. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy. He wore a simple, dark suit that looked less like tailored cloth and more like a second skin, midnight black and impossibly smooth. His movements were liquid, economical, and possessed a stillness that spoke of coiled, terrifying power. Nikolai Volkov was the man they all feared, the true, unseen master of the Volkov Group, the one whose signature meant life or death for businesses and, in Ilara's case, for homes. He was rumored to be the one who signed the demolition order. He was the Mafia boss, though no one ever dared to use that term aloud. They called him the CEO, the chairman, the shadow. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his face was a study in dangerous repose. Sharp angles, a mouth set in a permanent line of disinterest, and eyes the color of old, polished steel that seemed to absorb the light, rather than reflect it. He looked at Bartholomew, who was now sweating profusely, frozen in his aggressive stance. Then, Volkov's gaze traveled, slowly, deliberately, down the length of Ilara's frail body from her frightened, wide eyes, over the crumpled petition in her hand, to the torn, cheap cotton of the dress, and finally, settling on the small, pathetic tear. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like a physical weight on Ilara's chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move. She was trapped under the weight of his attention, an attention more menacing than Bartholomew's bullying, because it was intelligent, focused, and utterly devoid of emotion. He spoke, and his voice was low, a deep, resonant rumble that effortlessly cut through the silence. It wasn't a shout or a threat. It was a statement, a simple fact delivered with the unassailable authority of a god speaking to mere mortals. "What is the meaning of this disruption, Bartholomew?" Bartholomew stammered, licking his lips. Mr. Volkov! Sir, she intruded. She was causing a scene. She's dressed improperly. I was just removing her, as per protocol. She was mocking the event, sir. She was wearing a cheap dress." Nikolai Volkov didn't shift his gaze from Ilara. He only tilted his head fractionally, a movement so slight it was barely discernible. "A cheap dress," he repeated, the words rolling off his tongue with a precise, cold finality that made the security guard physically recoil. He took 2 slow steps toward her, crossing the invisible line that had separated the elite from the trespasser. He didn't look at Ilara's face, only at the tear in the fabric, an inch from her bare skin. Then he reached out. Ilara didn't flinch away, couldn't. His fingers, long and elegant, with not a single tremor, brushed the raw edge of the torn cotton. It was the lightest touch imaginable, yet it felt like a searing brand. He finally raised his eyes to hers. They were colder than she could have imagined, but there was something in their depth, not pity, not lust, but a strange, intense curiosity, a sudden sharp interest in something he clearly hadn't accounted for. He had seen her desperation, her humiliation, and her refusal to cry, and it had registered. He turned his head slowly, scanning the frozen faces of the onlookers, the smug Cynthia, the sneering man, the terrified Bartholomew. The contempt in his steel gaze was not for Ilara, but for them. They had mocked her for being poor, he mocked them for being petty. He straightened to his full, formidable height, his voice cutting through the silence like a freshly honed blade. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was only necessary. That's my woman. The 4 words dropped into the cavernous, glittering hall like an executioner's axe. Every head snapped. Every gasp was strangled. The sound of Cynthia's glass shattering on the marble floor was the only sign of breakage in the absolute stasis that followed. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her dizzy and lightheaded. My woman. What was he saying? He didn't know her. He had never seen her before. This was a lie, a dangerous, unfathomable masquerade. But the way he said it, the possessive finality, the sheer indifferent arrogance of the claim, it made the lie more real than any truth she had ever known. He then looked directly at Bartholomew, his eyes narrowing to pinpricks of icy malice. You ripped her dress. You shamed her. You accused her of mocking this establishment, while my guests stand here mocking her. His voice was lethal silk. You are relieved of duty now. Leave the premises. If I see your face again, your family will not see yours. Bartholomew didn't argue, didn't beg. He simply stumbled backward, his face a sickening shade of white, and bolted for the staff exit, the threat hanging behind him like poison gas. Volkov then turned back to the gallery of elites. He didn't raise his voice, but the entire room seemed to lean in, paralyzed by his attention. And as for the rest of you, he said, his gaze settling briefly, contemptuously, on the panicked Cynthia, I was under the impression this was an event for high society, not a middle school playground. The lady here is my guest. If I hear one more word about her attire, which, by the way, I find perfectly charming, I will know who to cut from my circle next. You will treat her with respect, or you will cease to exist in this city. He didn't need to elaborate. Everyone knew exactly what he meant by cease to exist: financial ruin, social exile, or something far, far worse. The crowd instantly dissolved. They didn't walk, they fled, turning their backs, muttering apologies and excuses, eyes darting away from Ilara, as if she were now a radioactive center of power. Volkov stood over her, casting a formidable shadow. The sheer proximity of his raw power was terrifying. He reached out again, and this time, he took the crumpled petition from her numb fingers. He smoothed it out, quickly scanning the names and the plea for the historic apartment building. This is what you came here for, he stated, not asked. You risked everything, including a public shaming for these people. It's my grandmother's home, Ilara managed to croak out, the words tasting of fear and residual shame. And all the others? They have nowhere else. The Volkov group can't just throw them out for a new development. He looked at her, truly looked at her this time, studying her sincerity, her defiance, her fragile courage. She saw a flicker of something she couldn't name in his eyes, a brief, dangerous spark of admiration. And you thought a piece of paper and a show of desperation would change my mind, he said, a ghost of an inflection in his voice that might have been amusement. I had to try, she whispered, her voice regaining a thread of strength, fueled by the tenant's fear and her grandmother's need. He folded the petition neatly and slipped it into the inside pocket of his immaculate suit jacket. Come with me. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was terrifying. He was the reason for all their troubles. He was the monster. But he had just saved her, claimed her, and demolished her tormentors with 4 quiet words. Why? She asked, the words sounding small and hopelessly naive in the echoing lobby. He didn't dignify the question with a full explanation. His steel eyes held hers, a silent, absolute command passing between them. If you've ever wished someone strong would step in when no one else would, when you felt utterly alone, mocked and helpless, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because Ilara is about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous man is the only man who can truly protect you. He led her not out of the hotel, but deeper in, through a service door that opened into a maze of silently moving, efficient staff, and then into a private elevator, all mirrors and dark wood, that ascended with alarming speed. Ilara stood rigidly in the corner, clutching the torn sides of her dress together. She could feel the lingering heat radiating off his body, the faint, clean scent of expensive cologne, and something else, something metallic and sharp, like danger. You don't know me, she finally forced herself to say, her voice trembling slightly. Why did you say that? Why your woman? He pressed a button marked penthouse and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. It was the most efficient way to achieve silence and ensure your immediate safety. Safety? she echoed, horrified. You've made me a target. Everyone here thinks I'm involved with you. A mafia boss. A Volkov. Indeed, he conceded, his eyes briefly flicking down to the place where her hand gripped the fabric. Which is infinitely preferable to being mocked, disgraced, and thrown into the street by a low-level brute and a herd of self-important parasites, wouldn't you agree? His logic was terrifyingly cold, but irrefutable. He had chosen the greater, more dangerous protection over the lesser, immediate humiliation. But why? Her first love, a college student named David, had left her because of a debt her grandmother had accrued. He'd told her, with a chilling lack of shame, I can't afford to be with someone who's one bad paycheck away from ruin, Ilara. You're a wonderful girl, but you're a burden. The word burden echoed the security guard's cheap. It was the language of the privileged dismissing the struggling. She had learned to expect it. It had created a shield of numbness, but moments ago, Volkov had shattered that shield by simply claiming her. You're using me, she accused, finding a sudden sharp clarity in her fear. You're trying to send a message to someone, to your rivals, that you can pick up a nobody from the streets and force the elite to bow. A display of power. His lips curled slightly, the briefest, most contained smile she had ever seen. It held no warmth, only a faint trace of dark amusement. You are more astute than your simple appearance suggests, Ilara. He used her name, the sound of it on his deep voice, a sudden intimate invasion. He must have read it on the petition. Is that not why you came here? He countered, his voice suddenly sharp, challenging. To be a display. To stand on my doorstep and demand an audience. You used your desperation as a weapon. I merely amplified the effect. The elevator doors opened onto a massive penthouse apartment, quiet, dark, and overwhelmingly opulent. The entire city stretched out beneath them, a silent sea of lights. The petition, she pressed, ignoring the terrifying view and the opulence, her mind focused only on her mission. Will you read it? Will you stop the demolition? He walked to a sleek, minimalist bar, carved from a single piece of dark granite, and poured a finger of amber liquid into a heavy glass. He didn't offer her anything. I already scanned it, he said, turning, the glass cold in his hand. Your grandmother's building. It's prime real estate. My plans for that district are substantial. Years in the making. So you'll still tear it down, she stated, the defeat settling heavy in her bones. The rescue, the claim, the sudden safety. It was all meaningless. She had failed. He took a slow sip of the drink, his gaze never leaving her face. I find myself in a peculiar position. I don't like when people are mocked on my property, and I especially dislike having to retract a public statement. What does that mean? It means I said you were my woman, he stated, the words once again possessive, absolute, and my woman does not have a grandmother who is homeless. It's bad for my image. It suggests poor management of my assets. Ilara stared at him, bewildered by the cold, transactional nature of his mercy. You're not doing it out of kindness, she whispered. I am not a kind man, Ilara, he confirmed, taking another, deeper sip of his drink. I am a powerful man. Power demands consistency. Your grandmother's building will not be demolished, not on the scheduled date, and likely, not ever. Consider the debt settled. Relief, so powerful it was nearly agonizing, rushed through her, making her sway. She had won. The families were safe. Her grandmother was safe, all because he had chosen her as his prop. Thank you, she said, the words inadequate, hollow. It is only the beginning of the transaction, he corrected, putting the glass down with a sharp clink on the bar. You are now publicly connected to me. You will not refute the claim. You will not speak of the petition. You will be seen with me at appropriate times. You will be my companion, my display, until I decide otherwise. No, she said, the single word a gasp of panic. I can't. I have my life. I have my jobs. I have my grandmother. You have no life, he said, walking slowly toward her, his proximity filling the air, cutting off the vast space of the penthouse. You have 2 underpaid jobs that barely pay for a decaying apartment, and you risk your dignity every day for the sake of survival. I have just given you your freedom from that. The debt is paid, but the transaction is ongoing. He stopped directly in front of her. She had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The intense stillness of his eyes was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Your jobs are terminated. All your debts, financial and otherwise, are gone. The apartment building is safe. Your grandmother is under my protection. You will move here to the adjoining suite. You will be given what you need. In return, you will be my companion. You will be a silent, beautiful extension of my authority. You are a debt I have called in, Ilara. And Volkov always collects. The cold transaction should have repelled her, but his proximity, his unwavering steel gaze, and the sudden fierce realization that she was safe for the first time in her life, it was overwhelming. He wasn't kind, but he was protection, a shield of absolute ruthless power that no one in her world could ever touch. What if I refuse? She whispered, knowing it was a ridiculous question. He didn't flinch. You won't. You have too much courage, Ilara, but not enough selfishness. You will accept for your grandmother, and you will accept because, somewhere deep down, you are tired of fighting alone. The truth of his words was a blow. She was tired, bone-weary of the constant struggle, the endless humiliation. She had always fought for others, but who had ever fought for her? No one, until now. And the dress, she asked, her voice barely audible. What about the cheap dress? A strange, almost imperceptible softening crossed his features. He reached out, and very gently, his thumb brushed the scraped skin visible through the torn fabric, tracing the line of the cheap cotton. It will be preserved, he murmured, his voice deepening slightly, a low, intimate tone that sent a shockwave through her. As a reminder of the day you stood up to an entire room of my guests, ruined or not. It is the most honest piece of clothing in this entire hotel. He stepped back, breaking the spell, becoming the cold, formidable boss once more. He gestured toward a doorway at the far end of the penthouse, behind a screen of dark, ribbed wood. Your suite is through there. Sleep. Tomorrow we begin. She stood there, paralyzed, looking at the door to her new life, a life of gilded cage, of absolute safety and absolute control. She was no longer Ilara, the struggling girl. She was now the Mafia boss's woman, claimed by a lie, saved by her own humiliation. The days that followed were a blur of transformation and tension. Ilara was outfitted in silence. Not a single designer item was purchased or even discussed by her. A small army of people, a stylist, a tailor, an assistant, simply materialized, measured and created. She was given dresses that felt like liquid midnight, shoes that were works of art, and a small, delicate diamond necklace that felt too heavy on her collarbone. But she refused to throw away the cheap, torn dress. She folded it neatly and hid it under the pile of silk nightgowns in her new closet. She and Nikolai Volkov clashed constantly, though never in front of others. Stop staring at me, she'd snap when they were alone in the penthouse, as he watched her with that cold, assessing gaze across the vast, polished expanse of the dining room table. I am assessing my investment, he'd reply calmly, without looking up from the sheaf of documents he was reading. I observe how you handle this new environment, how you hold your posture. You are still too stiff. You need to radiate ownership, not fear. I am terrified, she shot back, her voice shaking slightly. You are a monster, and I am in a cage. He finally looked up, his eyes catching the light with a sharp glint. A monster who ensured your grandmother's safety. A cage that keeps out debt, hunger, and humiliation. A cage that keeps you. The intimacy began to creep in, slow and insidious, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. One night, at a formal dinner with a group of his associates, men and women whose names held the weight of untold wealth and power, Ilara accidentally spilled a few drops of red wine onto her pristine white gown. She froze, feeling the familiar hot rush of shame, the panic that she was about to ruin everything, that the low-level clumsiness of her old life was showing through. Before she could even apologize, Volkov's hand was on her arm, his thumb running a smooth, distracting circle on her skin, hidden beneath the table. It is of no consequence, he murmured, his voice low, only for her. My tailor can fix a dress. If anyone stares, I will blind them. Focus on the conversation. Moya Zvezda, my star. The Russian endearment, cold and possessive, felt like a sudden, fierce anchor. He hadn't been kind. He had been protective, fiercely, ruthlessly protective of his claim. He wasn't protecting her from a stain. He was protecting her from the judgment of others. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her enormous, soft bed, feeling utterly alienated. The room was beautiful, but she missed the comforting sound of the radiator hissing in her old apartment. She walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. She felt a sudden deep sob rise in her chest, not of fear but of gratitude, of confusion, of the sheer lonely weight of this impossible situation. A moment later, a quiet knock came at the door that connected her suite to the main penthouse. It was Nikolai. He was wearing silk pajama pants and a white t-shirt, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked less like the Mafia boss and more like a man stripped down for the night, but no less formidable. "I heard you," he said simply, his voice low. "You are crying." "I'm not," she lied, quickly wiping her cheek. He didn't move from the doorway. He just watched her. "You are grieving your old life, Ilara. It is permitted, but you will not do it silently." She broke down then, a harsh, uncontrollable sob that shook her shoulders. He crossed the room in 2 strides and sat on the bed beside her, his presence a dark, immovable weight. He didn't touch her, but he didn't pull away either. He just sat there, allowing her tears to fill the silent, opulent room. When her sobs subsided, he finally spoke. "You see your own strength, but you do not see how others perceive it. You faced the entire Volkov lobby with nothing but a torn dress and a piece of paper. You are fearless." "I was terrified," she whispered. "Fear is a catalyst," he countered, his voice rough. "Not a weakness. I am feared because I wield power. You are admired because you wield courage. Do not mistake the source of your influence." He stood up. The intimacy was over. He had simply allowed the release and validated her strength in his own, cold way. "Go to sleep, Ilara. We have a meeting in the morning." And he left, closing the door behind him. The danger still circled them. Volkov's rivals were watching, testing, probing the weakness of this sudden public claim. A woman who came out of nowhere, with no family, no wealth, and a history of poverty. She was a target. One evening, they were leaving a private gallery opening, surrounded by 4 of Volkov's formidable security detail, men who were as quiet and deadly as their boss. As they were descending the exterior steps, a single dark sedan surged past the curb, and a flash of light erupted from the passenger window, not a camera flash, but the distinct, terrifying muzzle flash of a gun. The world went into slow motion. Ilara only heard the loud crack and the shattering sound of a nearby planter box. Before her brain could process the noise, Volkov moved. He didn't flinch, didn't shout. He simply slammed his entire body into hers, throwing her behind the thick limestone column of the entrance, covering her with his own body. He was a wall of muscle and absolute control, shielding her from the concrete, the noise, the potential bullets. "Stay down," he commanded, the urgency making his voice a raw rasp in her ear. She felt the heavy, terrifying thump of his heart against her back, and the familiar scent of his cologne was mixed with the sharp smell of gunpowder and fear. But it wasn't his fear. It was the raw, protective adrenaline of a predator defending its territory. His security detail returned fire instantly, a disciplined, overwhelming burst of retaliation that sent the sedan careening into the street divider. The air was thick with the immediate brutal violence of his world. When the silence returned, thick and tense, Volkov remained pressed against her for a long, agonizing moment. His breath was warm on her neck. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low, checked, and utterly furious. "No, you?" "No," he confirmed, but his hand gripped her shoulder with a fierce, possessive pressure that was almost painful. He pulled back, his eyes burning with an incandescent rage that wasn't directed at the attacker, but at the sheer, cold fact that something had dared to come close to her. "They will pay for this," he said, not as a threat, but as a silent, absolute guarantee. He was talking to himself, to the world, to the very universe. No one touches his. The adrenaline and the shock finally hit Ilara. Her legs gave out. She didn't fall to the pavement because Volkov caught her instantly. He lifted her easily into his arms, pulling her tight against his chest. His security detail watched without expression. They didn't ask questions. They just formed a tight, impenetrable circle around their boss and the woman he carried. He walked with her to his armored car, his footsteps measured and dominant. He didn't put her down until they were inside the dark, luxurious cabin. He looked at her then, his hand running along her cheek, a touch of tenderness that was as foreign as it was magnetic. "They tested me," he said, his voice quiet, filled with a dangerous conviction. "They saw a girl in a beautiful dress and thought she was a weakness. They will never make that mistake again." He didn't claim her because he loved her. He claimed her because she was his, and his property would never be touched. But in that moment, cradled in the darkness of the car, with the smell of danger and his clean scent filling her senses, Ilara knew that his possessive protection was the most intoxicating thing she had ever experienced. It was forbidden, it was dangerous, and it was entirely, brutally real. The final reversal came weeks later, after another tense public appearance. They had been to a charity auction, where Ilara, still uncomfortable with the high society and the glittering contempt in some eyes, had mostly remained silent. As they left, a well-known society columnist, one who had written snarky pieces, hinting at Ilara's unknown common origins, approached Volkov. "Mr. Volkov," the man said, a sneer barely hidden by a polite smile, "your companion is exquisite, but there is a great deal of curiosity about her background. She is a refreshing change from your usual company. One wonders where you found such a perfectly silent, lovely piece of art." The implication was clear. She was a trophy, a purchase, nothing more. Ilara tensed, preparing for Volkov's cold, dismissive retort, the acknowledgement that she was, indeed, only a prop. But Nikolai didn't dismiss her. He looked at the columnist with those steel eyes, the expression in them colder than the Arctic wind. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply wrapped his arm around Ilara's waist, pulling her flush against his side, his hand resting possessively on her hip, right near the spot where the old, cheap dress had been ripped. He didn't speak to the columnist, he spoke to Ilara, his lips brushing the curve of her ear, his voice a low, intimate promise that only she could hear. "Look at them," he whispered. "They look at you now, and see a queen. They see power, they see the woman of Volkov, they see the woman I shielded with my body. No one sees the girl in the torn, cheap dress anymore. That girl is mine now, only mine. I keep her safe." He straightened, finally glancing at the columnist, whose face had gone pale with confusion and fear at the sudden sensual intimacy. "Your question is irrelevant," Nikolai said, his voice flat, absolute. He then turned Ilara away from the onlookers, ending the conversation, ending the scrutiny. He led her through the doors, out to the waiting car, and only when they were inside, the partition separating them from the driver was up, did he look at her. Ilara was breathless, her skin tingling where his hand had rested. His possessiveness was intoxicating. The whispered claim had made her feel more cherished than any declaration of love. He reached out, cupped her face in his large, warm hand, and tilted her chin up. His eyes, usually cold, were suddenly dark, intense, and shockingly readable. There was desire there, yes, but also a deep, fierce satisfaction. "You are no longer a struggling girl," he said, his voice a velvet command. "You are no longer humiliated. You are not a burden. You are not a prop." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her lips, the tension between them, a live, electric wire. "From this moment, no one touches you. No one speaks ill of you. No one threatens you. They all now understand who you belong to. You're mine." And then, his mouth came down on hers, a kiss that was both a seal of possession and a fierce, forbidden promise. It was the taste of danger, of absolute safety, and the irreversible claim of a man who took what he wanted and never let go. The woman who was mocked for a cheap dress was now claimed by the most ruthless man in the city. The transaction was complete, and the heart-wrenching romance had finally begun.